All right.
Well, it's time to go. Hey, folks, here's Rich. Have a nice meeting.
Either I need no introduction or it's, All right. So welcome everyone. Look, there's a few things or a few topics we want to kind of cover over the, I guess, 45 minutes or so that we'll spend here this evening. What I am totally comfortable with you all coming off mute, asking questions. I can certainly try and put the chat up so that I can see what's happening inside of there. But yeah, let's keep this interactive. Usually, if you all have questions or things that you want to ask about, I am totally fine with going in that kind of a direction. So let's see. First thing on the list is so for the course of the session tonight, we're going to talk about three things, which is a lot to fit in less than an hour, but we'll see where it goes. We're going to talk about actions. We're going to talk about Codespaces, and we're going to talk about some future tech like called Copilot. That'll be interesting. We'll save that one for last. I, if it's okay, I'm thinking of starting with actions, and maybe for either in the chat or we get reactions in here. No, we just get raised hand. Let's do that. For anybody, either drop a note in the chat or raise your hand. How many people have used actions before or recently? I got one. Okay. Bill, you didn't raise your hand? All right. I got two. Okay, cool. So it looks like just based on that, this might be new for a lot of people. So what I'm going to do is I will start off in that direction and just talk about actions and kind of see where that conversation goes. When we think about if you've done anything with GitHub or with Azure DevOps, obviously they're great for getting your code in place and for doing development and maintaining your code. But one of the great things about both of those tools is they give you the ability to push that code, build it, create some kind of an artifact, and go push that code up into some kind of an environment, whether it's Azure, whether it's another cloud, whether it's your on-premises environment. The capability is essentially to have the ability to take your code and your code product and push it to some environment. When we think about GitHub Actions can do a lot more than just that. It is really a workflow type engine that gives you the capabilities to not only listen for when things happen inside of your repository. So when you do a check-in, when you do a pull request, but also, when you create an issue, maybe you might have some set of steps or some workflow that you want to have happen as a result of an issue getting created, or when you maybe when you do some kind of a check-in, you want to go off and talk to other services. So all of those things are basically possible because it's essentially a workflow engine. As long as you can connect to it, there's a way to get that data and to get that information into the process that is happening inside of that workflow. And when we think about GitHub Actions, there's a number of different places where actions can come from, essentially. So why don't I do this? Let me bring up a repository here. So give me 1 second, and I will share my screen before somebody says it. Going to close a couple things down. Cool. All right. Go this route. All right. You guys all see my screen? No feedback here that that's happening.
Yep.
Yes, yep.
Cool. All right. So this is GitHub. Since this might be new to some of you, but essentially inside of here, we have the ability to take a repository and start to look through essentially an action. So I'm going to go into here. Let's do this one. So this is just a repo, and I'll show you. This is actually got created as a result of a lab that I did with GitHub, but it's a great way to showcase what's inside of an action and what makes up an action. So it's easy for you to get created, get what's started. All of the actions are going to reside inside of this folder here, and I'm going to screen resolution up a little bit so y'all can see it. It's going to reside inside of this folder here. So GitHub/workflows. So doesn't matter what repository you build, as long as you put something in here, it will now become available for you to look at on this Actions tab. And the Actions tab is where whatever files are listed in that location will be available here. So I can can click on one of them, I can see how it ran, I can see the status of those with the green check mark or the red X saying that particular workflow failed. I can go into it, and this, if you've done, for those who haven't done Actions, maybe you've done Azure DevOps pipelines, this may look kind of familiar, in that I can drill into that particular run, and I can see all of these components here. These are called steps inside of the run that happened, and I can see the outputs related to all of that. So it's a way for me to, once it goes ahead and automatically runs, I can go back and take a look and see kind of what was going on, what happened, and especially for the ones. So I go back up to my actions and look at the one that failed. I can see specifically what the error was around our specific action. Let's see, where's the built, right, and down to this last line here where it had some kind of an error that obviously I fixed because we got it working in the next run. It was a while ago I did these, just forget what the issue specifically was. But it becomes very easy to run these and kick them off. If I go back into Actions, see if I click this one, does not. All right, I will show you one in a little bit. There is, so as we mentioned, workflows and actions can essentially be kicked off from a number of methods. This one is going to essentially run anytime somebody pushes code to the repository, not necessarily to any branch. Inside of, you have the capability to say, I want you to run if somebody pushes against a specific branch. I want this action to run if somebody builds a pull request against our repository. So all of those are possible triggers essentially for an action. We could also have a trigger that goes against an issue. We could also have a trigger that is just a timer where this action runs every evening or runs on some scheduled basis, maybe once a week, once a month, what have you. That capability of what you want to, of when you want that to run is where we define in our in the on section up here at the top. And then inside of there, we have a number of different jobs. So each job in and of themselves has basically runs potentially on a virtual machine. Well, they all will run on a virtual machine. These virtual machines will typically come from the collection of GitHub runners. That's their term for the virtual machines that are waiting to take these actions. You might see if you start up an action, it'll say it's waiting for a queue, and then when that queue kicks off or when that queue is done, the action goes ahead and runs whenever becomes available. And the reason that works, and that's the same way that Azure DevOps works for comparison, is that when you do this, you're going to check out your code. Typically, that's the first step, so that the code gets on the machine, because that machine is kind of it's just an empty machine. Like you, bless you.
Thank you.
Just like you were to go ahead and hit, if you were to rebuild the machine, that's kind of the state you're in. so you need to bring down the things that you need to run on that machine. In this case, our GitHub Actions code checks out our code. We get a local version of that. And then any number of steps can be compiled together to do some kind of a process. Typically, you might use that to build your code and have that be that build ultimately pushed to some kind of an Azure environment, and then be able to, or some kind of other hosting environment, and then in which case your application will run out there. This one specifically here, what I'm going to do is do a, excuse me, an edit. I can edit this in the browser. I can check out the code and bring it locally, or clone the code and bring it locally, and have it available to run there. And I could create actions there as well. By doing it up here in the browser, I get some of the things, again, making, since only a couple of people had raised their hands around GitHub Actions, hoping that means a lot of people have done things like Azure DevOps, and a lot of the capabilities we see here kind of call back to some of the things we saw in DevOps, right? So if I was looking for something like .NET, right, I could have a list of actions that are related to .NET. So if I click on this one specifically, it will show me the typical steps related to that action. So I can see the things that I want to include. Optionally, I need to include the .NET version, the source URL for any package source, who the owner is. These are optional capabilities that I might want to include in that action as far as setting this up. And then if I want more information, I can go out to the marketplace. So while there are a number of actions, let's see if I can back to where we were. Let's say I wanted to look at Azure. See here, and I can see here's the code that I would need to essentially put into my. I copied it. I can go ahead into here and put a step. Formatting is very important. Let's see. Happy. So I would need to put some pieces in there around application name. And any of the optional ones. What's this image one? Starter command if I have one. So it becomes that easy to essentially get a step in here. And now once it did these first two steps, I have this optional parameter in here around name. I could do the same thing with these, right? I could go ahead and say important is because you can look at this. Look at the actual run of the action, you can see that where the name would come into place, right? So having that name show up out here at this thing, though, with there not being a name when this one ran, it's just going to say, hey, what we ran at this step was actions-checkout. But now that we've got a name in there, you would see the name take that place essentially. So name is really important when it goes back to reviewing what's going on inside of your actions. Yep. Okay. All right. So it's easy to get going and get started. There are a number of default actions that that are available to you for things like checking out or running various commands against the GitHub repositories. A number of partners, third-party players essentially have created their own actions. So Azure has, if we go out to the Azure market or to the marketplace, we can look for actions related to. I thought there's over here. Actually, okay. So when we got to the marketplace, we can see information about the action that we're trying to bring down. This link here will take us to the repository. So we can take a look at that and see, well, here is the Azure web deploy or web apps deploy. You'll see when you have here, because they've registered this, they've included a manifest around the action. We can see that, hey, this particular repository is an action that's available to you, and you can go and view that link that we are just looking at out on Marketplace. But what's great about this is it's an available repository. If you want to make changes to it and maybe fork this or have your own slightly different version of that, you certainly can do that. And that gets into to mention that you can create your own custom actions so that you have the ability to, with a little bit of code, define different steps, different processes that you want to include as part of your workflow for when code gets checked in or when an issue happens. One of the ways we did this for one of our internal environments was when somebody creates an issue saying we want to take some code and promote it into the production environment in our Azure subscription. One of the things we asked the users to create an issue. And when they create an issue, they have a couple of checkboxes, and depending on the checkbox, like if the checkbox says, hey, this has PCI information in it or PII information in it, then we will, prior to deploying the code, make sure that the appropriate policies in that Azure subscription are put in place so that the underlying infrastructure is secure and locked down, so that we can put that application in there with all of the security approved bells and whistles to make sure that that app runs appropriately. So it can become a much more complex bed for really getting not only infrastructure as code, but having that repeatable process of getting your environment created the way that that you need it to be created. I want to go back into this one here. So this particular application that we were just kind of building around, I'm going to move off this. Yeah, fine. Go back into the actions. You'll see here inside of this action, we have this one that is uses, and there's no author, if you will, right? There's no Azure / or actions / but it's just got a dot. So in this case, that dot meaning, hey, it resides inside of our repository. And I could take a look at the code. Action A, which is what we were looking at, and you can see here I've got some definition associated with this particular folder. So there's a Docker file. So this particular action, custom action that we created, runs inside of its own container. Have to. I mean, they can, if they're JavaScript based, they can certainly run on their own. But if you have some special languages, because you can create your own action in different many different languages, I believe this one is just essentially a bash script. We'll take a look at it in a second. But you see it's running in a Linux Debian container. It has, some of the common pieces you would think inside of a Docker file, and then finally that entry point for where that code is going to go ahead and launch into. Back to here. This is the information around our action. So our action, when it's custom, we typically give it a name, some kind of a description, who the author is, and then if there are any inputs, what do we expect to be included when somebody instantiates this action or this custom action inside of their action. Then because we know this is running inside of a container, we got to make sure we bring that container information as well for the action. So this basically defines how your action, what your custom action needs from an input, output, as well as where it needs to run. And then finally, we have this bash shell, which basically just says, does a hello world with the person's specific name in there. So they can be that simple. They can be obviously much more complex than this. And if you look around the marketplace, you can see some of the custom actions that were created out there. But that's all you need. Those three things. If it's JavaScript or TypeScript, you can actually get past the actual container component and just run that inside of your action itself. Any questions around actions or just kind of what they can be used for, what they can do? I see a hand raised. Is that Mel?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Hey, go for it. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, so is there an option to configure the machine that's gonna build the code? Because I didn't see that anywhere.
Yeah, so you can create custom runners, and then in which case you would define what goes, what becomes the gold master of that virtual machine, and then use that for your to run your actions inside of, essentially. So much like
okay.
you did in.
So it sounds like you set that up as an sort of like a container and image, and then you call it inside the action.
So yeah, from the action you would say which. Let me go back to here. Right, so this action is going to say, hey, we run on Ubuntu latest. I'll find the documentation for it and post it back into the teams here. But you basically would say, well, I want you to use this runner as the virtual machine where you're going to go ahead and deploy my code into, or deploy my action into, I should say, and it'll run that way. But yeah, you can definitely build your own custom runners, have whatever components you want inside of them, have them hosted in your own environments, however it is, or wherever it is you want to host those as well.
Gotcha. Because normally it's the pain of setting up all the dependencies that you need, right? So
it can be, yeah. I mean, if you have something that's very specific, you need that for every time your application runs, yeah, that would certainly be a reason to look at the custom runner path. You then take on the maintenance of making sure that those,
right.
It's like when we did. It's like when we did virtual machines on our laptops, right? We had to make sure that we patched everything, and then we made a gold master, essentially, and we created virtual machines off of that stamp, essentially. Well, that has to get updated every so often. Same thing here when we think about the underlying OS and the whatever components we put on top of there. Those all have to continue to get updated. So you do end up maintaining that, but obviously there's some benefits, and you can get your custom pieces on there and not have to take as much time to download them every time you do a build.
Cool. Thanks.
Yep, absolutely. Other questions?
Hey, Rich.
Yeah.
So I have a couple. I don't want to dominate the conversation, but to cut me off any time. But number one, what happened was when I set up I think I initially set up my action, and then what happened was I wanted to deploy it to Azure. I found like a lab or something like that on how to do that. And when I went to Azure to set up the app service, I guess when I set up it, I think it prompted me to say, "Hey, where's your repo at?" I think I remember correctly, prompting me where my repo is at, and I said it was in GitHub, and basically it created this action just for me. Like I already had one, but it created like a new one.
Right.
I thought that was really I was like, wow, that was so much, like, it was good to go through the experience and learn it. But I was like, oh, wow, it's I think I actually deleted mine and kind of used theirs because it seemed like, they probably know better it was the first one I ever did. So I was like, let me use theirs instead of mine. But I thought that was really kind of helpful, and how it just worked.
Yeah. I mean, so I think I know that there is and I'm looking at, I'll bring up this one here. This is an app service, and there is a deployment center. This probably, correct me if this wasn't where you were.
That does look familiar, yeah.
And then you say, hey, where's my source code? I can say it's in GitHub, and then
Right.
what account I want to use. I'm not going to go through this because I know mine won't match just because of some of the other orgs I belong to. But once you go through all of this, it will then go and create that action for you. And you certainly can wire that up and do it yourself, right? If you, I think it's this one. So I've got a deployment here to Azure, and I think I can use Azure/web.
But I think that the demo I had to go through was because I had to set up some form of key or something like that to kind of set the two together. And again, when I went through the exercise, I saw that it could just hook together. But I think there's some there's a key that was set up. I can't remember, like a SAS or something like that. I'm not too sure what it was exactly. But that kind of leads to my second question. So I was kind of surprised that. Go ahead.
Sorry, before you jump off of that, let me just touch on that because that's really important, right? So we have the web app deploy action that you can include inside of your workflow action. It will need two things to make that connection to Azure. One of two things to make that connection to Azure, because it doesn't know, your GitHub account doesn't necessarily know your Azure account, even though there is ways to sign in with GitHub in Azure. So you need one of two things. You will need either what's called a service principal, and that is essentially think of a service account against your Azure AD environment where your Azure subscription lives. And that service principal would need to have some level of permissions in that subscription. So whether it's, just contributor and it can create resource groups or create resources inside of that Azure environment, or narrowing the scope down and maybe saying, well, you can only, this thing only has web application permissions and that's all it has, right? The other way to do it is not create a service principal account, but to do to download the publishing profile. So off of the overview here, that's why we can leave this. Up here at the top, there is a publishing profile, and that is essentially a manifest that tells all the information whatever application needs to push this code into this particular app service. Included in there is a username related to the actual name of your app service and a very long password. What you would then do is take that information, that publishing profile, and push it into the secrets of your repository. Take a look at that here. Let's do this. Settings. Yep. Leave. This is really, and thank you for bringing it up because it is a really important bit of information around here. And then you can, inside of the secrets area, you would say, I want a new repository secret. I can give my secret a name and call it my profile. Add it now as a secret. And then if I go back to code, close the botnet, down in here, wherever it is that I need to put that value, you would reference that through. Come on. You have red squiggles in there because it's in the wrong place. That's how you can reference that. So thank you for bringing that. Great question. And I will get to your other questions as well. Why don't you go ahead and tell me what your next one was?
Well, I just want to emphasize, yeah, so I do want to go back to the initial point was that, again, I think I found a post on how to deploy GitHub to Azure. And I went through all the steps you showed me, and they were kind of a little cryptic to me. I got it to work, but they were a little weird to me. But again, if you, and I don't remember the exact steps, I did it a couple months ago, but when I set up the Azure app service, all that, what you just said happened automatically. I didn't do anything. It just it created the YAML file. It created all the keys, and I was like, wow. And I said, that was so easy. I wish I knew how to do. But again, I learned a lot. But again, at the same time, I was like, well, that was way easier. So going back to that whole thing, I was a little taken back that I had to create the app service to deploy it. In a sense, I'm so used to using Azure Devops with ARM templates. So can you create actual services using GitHub Actions? Can I create the app service on the fly? Oh, you can. Okay.
Yep. Yeah, and you have, obviously ARM templates are things that we're used to from the Azure side of things, but so whether you do it through some kind of an ARM template, whether you do it through some kind of a CLI scripting, so you can reference the Azure CLI inside of a GitHub action. If you wanted to use Bicep or Terraform, any of those type of domain-specific languages for creating your infrastructure, all of those are possible through a GitHub action.
Okay. And I'm a pretty regular listener to your Dev Talk show. I usually listen to it offline. And I think a couple of months ago, you guys were talking about GitHub and GitHub Actions, and I think one of you guys mentioned that there, and again, maybe you weren't talking about GitHub or GitHub Actions, but I kind of picked up. Is there a way to, on GitHub to like push a button and it will automatically run an ARM template and actually automatically create basically, have the environment, if basically what I'm saying, like if I'm interviewing for a job is, hey, why don't you check out one of my apps? And I just send them hey, go to this repo and just push a button and it deploys it. So again, I think you guys were talking about that a few shows back, and you didn't really talk too much about it. You just kind of mentioned, I think it might have been Chris who mentioned it. I wasn't too sure if you know anything about that at all, if that's possible.
Yeah, so there is, here we go. Yeah, so we used to have this kind of a button here.
Yeah, cool.
And it would look at your ARM template and say, well, these are the parameters inside of my ARM template that I need to capture. So when I click that button, I will then get taken to a web page or a web form that sits inside of, I'm pretty sure it sat inside of the Azure subscription, and it gave me all of the parameters that I needed to complete. And I could go ahead and run through and complete them, because what it's doing is it's ultimately creating a deployment against a resource group inside of your Azure subscription. So this lets you put that functionality on top of your GitHub repo, essentially, as long as you have an ARM template defined that can then be pushed into Azure for the deployment.
Cool. Okay, great. That's about all I have. Thank you.
Oh, awesome. Thank you. Awesome questions. Appreciate it. And since that was one of the things I did want to call, just to kind of show through some of the complexities that you can do when it comes to GitHub and Actions. And actually, we'll into and Andy Schwam. This is essentially a repository that we have here, and this one is uses GitHub Pages. We did a show on static web pages, but what's really interesting inside of this one is that we've got a workflow, and this particular workflow, I think it's this one. Yeah, we actually went through, and because what we wanted to do was every time we did a show, we wanted to create a blog page contents that were up in YouTube. So it turns out, if you look at the marketplace and you look at some of the actions that are out there and created, there's actually an action that will let us do an HTTP request. And in this case, we're doing an HTTP request against Google's API, looking for our particular channel name. And we've got a secret in here that is our API key, so that's kind of hidden from everybody's view. And we're basically doing that to get a list of shows, and then from that we take the most recent video and get the information about that specific video, and then use that to replace tokens inside of a file that we then post into that we then include inside of our web page. So there's looking at the rich ecosystem that's out there in the marketplace, there really is many complex things that you can do when it comes to actions. And if you get to a point where you can't do what it is you want to do, you can build the action yourself, right? So we can always build whatever it is we need to do inside of code. So this is just one of those examples around how things can get kind of complex, and really take these crazy ideas that we have and start to bring them to light. I do want to talk about this repo a little bit, because this brings us to kind of the next conversation. I will pause. Any last questions about actions, just so we can kind of get the other two topics up and going? How hard is it to, David has a question, how hard is it to convert DevOps pipelines to GitHub Actions? Are there tools to do it, or is this all manual? It is similar to YAML based. I don't know of any tools yet that do that. I don't know. Let's try and see if maybe something has come out. If you are on Azure DevOps and you want to move to GitHub, those tools will eventually make their way there as things start to get to a point where people need to think about moving from one version of one application to another. So let's see, Azure DevOps. Here's an article in our docs that talk about so migrating and giving some of the things to be aware of, some of the key differences, and some of the things to think about. And specifically, probably the biggest thing is the syntax differences potentially between these two methods of deploying and creating your code. So I would definitely check this out. Don't know tool yet. That is, let's make sure there's nothing else in here. Yeah, I would definitely focus here on this particular article to kind of give some information around how you might do that. Cool. All right. Thank you for that question. That's awesome. Thank you, Mel, for dropping some of the links in the chat. That's great. I'm going to go back to this one here. This particular code base is, it is that shows directory that I mentioned. We have a number of, this is essentially the GitHub's pages that got created as a result of that component. This particular one here is really where this initial idea and thought came from around static site generation and building a site to support that using GitHub Pages. So GitHub Pages will let you, inside of any repository, let you create essentially a static web application. Maybe it talks about your project, maybe it talks about your organization. This one here specifically talks about our organization. You can put a vanity URL against it. So there's a lot of great features that are basically included for free when we think about GitHub Pages and the ability to go ahead and create those. If I go to Pages, there's information about how you would go ahead and get started. One of the things that GitHub Pages uses, while it's a repository, right? I can check out that code. I can make the changes I want to on a page. I can push it. But when I look at the page, once the site gets created, I see something where I had a typo or whatever. I make the change, do it back in. You can only do that so many times, right? Before there's certain rate limits on having that static page generation run every time your repo gets checked in. So in order to do some local development, there is, you can connect this with a number of different site static site generators, but in this case we're using Jekyll is what is kind of recommended, or the default as it were. Jekyll is a Ruby on Rails application, if I'm not mistaken, but it does require, since I run Windows, it will require a lot of configuration and management to get that running inside of my environment. So instead of potentially deploying those components on my machine and having to make sure I have them next time I build it out, one of the things I can do is create a code space based off of the dev container definition that's in here. And much like the Docker file that we saw inside of the action, we have essentially inside of our dev container.json, have the information we need to spin up a container environment, as well as any kind of extensions or applications we need to include in there. And yeah, so we actually have our Docker file that includes everything we need, all the information it needs to set up that container for us. So what will happen is that when we run Codespaces, and this used to, I think this started out as Visual Studio Codespaces and since moved over to be Docker or GitHub Codespaces. The idea is that I can very easily take a project that's out there and get up and running on that project without having to worry about all the dependencies I need to install on my app on my local machine. Especially important if you don't have admin rights on your local machines, like many people don't, especially in corporate environments. So this becomes a quick way to get up and start it. So I have Codespaces. I'm going to say, give me a new one. and it is going to look at the Docker file that is in this particular repository and start building out that container. Now, I can do that, and I can run this inside of the browser, essentially. I could also open up this code space inside of VS Code on my desktop. So the idea is that I could bring down the repository, have a container that gets created, and then open the files that came down in that clone inside of that container that's defined by the Docker file. So now I'm building out my application inside of that container space. So I'm going to do that here. I've already previously downloaded this particular, or didn't I? Thought we did. Let's see. Hang on. Let's try this. Let that run in the background. I'll bring this up. Have it. Okay. Let's do this. Let's just this. Here. Take this and open code. Open, of course, out of the screen. Let's bring this up. You can see I have that same repository here. What it does is GitHub, or I'm sorry, not GitHub, Visual Studio Code says, hey, you've got a dev container configuration. Do you want to reopen this in a container? Docker is running. Otherwise, it's a really short demo. Yep, cool. Yep, it's back up and running. Reopen it in a container. It's going to take a few seconds. And down here in the lower left-hand corner, that's where you see the remote connection information. So this is something that Visual Studio Code has been doing for some time. It actually will let you remote connect into a container environment that's running on your machine. So think of, this is just using Jekyll, so all the Ruby dependencies go out of the way. How often do we need to deploy Python to our environment? And, is it Python 2 something? Is it Python 3? 3 what? All of those various dependencies that can collide inside of a Python environment. If we just had a Docker container that hosted our Python workload, then it would make it very easy for us to do. I believe there is a repository that gives a this one here. I'll drop this in the chat to see it. This is how you can do it if you don't have Codespaces. You can do this here, Visual Studio Code, and a running instance of some Docker component. I'm running WSL2 in the Docker desktop engine, just for completeness. Here we go. All the predefined container configuration. So this is what you would want to look for. This is essentially the VS Code using the old nomenclature. These are all of the potential code repository or Codespaces containers that you can essentially create. You can see there's a bunch of samples there, but you can certainly pick them from the containers repository here. So if you want to run Azure Functions .NET Core 3.1 inside of a container, remote into it, this is where you would go ahead and find it. There's your dev container, and it's here. There's your Docker file and your dev container file. You take these, you drop them into your project, and then now you'll have the capabilities to run with this configuration, either in VS Code or in Codespaces. And I'll drop that here. Has anybody had a chance to play around with Codespaces or remote containers inside of VS Code? All right. Show of hands for those who are in the chat room, or type in the chat if you're now interested in doing Codespaces or remote containers inside of Visual Studio Code. I got one. Thank you, John. Thank you, Corey. There's two. Mel, thank you, Bill. Awesome. Thank you all. Yes, when we have been doing remote sessions for the last 20 plus months, we do need a little bit of validation of, some of the presentation that we're doing inside of here. So thank you for validating that. This next section, I also want to be a little bit of audience participation, if you will, because probably have about 5 or 10 minutes left. What I want to do is spin up a new instance of Visual Studio Code. Actually, it's probably not needed. Let me see if I do this. Let me do, not that. Let's. So in here. So here I'm going to do that new console application. Cool. Copilot. Yes. All right, let's do this then. So if I go into code, code environment now. Honest, I have not done this since the new build on this machine. So let's see how this works. This little icon in the lower right hand corner is Copilot. Now, if you have for Visual Studio Code extensions, and I look for the Copilot extension, you'll see that, there is this capability here called Copilot, your AI pair programmer. So what this does is helps you write code by making suggestions based off what it is that you are typing. So this AI algorithm has looked at numbers of different code bases and is able to, based on what it knows and what it understands, is able to make suggestions on what might be an appropriate next line, next method, what have you. So we're going to take a look at that and see what that looks like. So you can certainly install the extension if you are not part of the program, because by signing into GitHub and getting access to the Copilot repo, that's what you need to kind of get this up and running. So just having the extension is not enough, but it is, the first step. So inside of here, I'm going to go back to my application, and I've got this CS program here. If I wanted to read a line of code, this is where I'm happy to take suggestions for what you might want to do. If I do a new file, let's do this. Let's call this one math. Here we are, public class math. Just like that, if I'm doing a math class, well, you probably are doing some kind of, there might be certain functions that your math class might need, and it gives me, and let me know if all should be able to see that gray IntelliSense that kind of pops back, but it's suggesting that you probably want a method to add two numbers together. And I think it's this. So there are multiple ways that you can format that code. And what I'm doing is I'm actually going from Alt and square brackets to shift through the permutations of bringing out the same method, essentially. So, well, this is the one that I want. I can say tab, and boom, that method is now part of my class. If I say In fact, if you want to add, that's what I want to do. Multiply. All right. I probably wouldn't have called it mul, but I get it. Three letters for that. Yep. Do tab. And then what do you think we'll have next? Right. So now searching of all of those things, I was very easily able to get up and running with my code, or just with a couple of tabs and some IntelliSense, able to get that class created very quickly. If I go ahead and create another class, and I'm going to call this one Twitter.cs class. Twitter. Oh, if I could spell. Twitter. Oh. It still thinks we're in math, but let's say tweet. I'm going to do this as a comment. See what happens. Give me some rough information around a method with a post. Still wants to do that, so you can do this. It is. I can go ahead and do that there. Let's see. So give me a generic one like that. When we did this before, there's actually a URL format when we tried this out a few months ago, and it actually gave me a formatted string that points back to YouTube. So it's youtube.com/ I think it's the ID or ID equals with a space for the code. But you see, just by I can put comments in, I can put a little bit of basically just some information based on the last time here. Let's see. Oh, in the last couple of minutes, I guess, from the folks in the chat, anything you want to, this is your chance. What should we type in? What should we try? What should we try and look for, right? And what these methods might be, just based on the fact that I've got these kind of methods up here. Now, it's not foolproof. So you're still the owner of the code, right? Because you have somebody looking over your shoulder saying, hey, we need this method, we need this method, we need this method. Still having that ability to maintain and determine what code gets into your classes, into your application, is still your role as the developer. So we're not going anywhere yet. But the idea is, and this is all very much, preview components at this point, but going forward, think of kids who are in school now and how they might, write code in the future. I think that's kind of the thing to be aware of.
So, Rich, can you type in "open the pod bay door"? How? All right. Well, I made
Give me a method.
This would be really interesting if they could voice enable it. It could sort of be, it could sort of be your home assistant for coding.
Yeah, and this one I like because there was a video game where it was that the I guess the translation into English came up to be all your bases are belong to us. So that is by starting to type in that code, it has a bit of a sense of humor as well.
Hey Rick, so is this looking at oh, I guess where is it getting trained? What?
It's Skynet.
Oh, cool. You're gonna have Terminators now.
Yeah, if you go out to the copilot.github.com site, there is information on there about how they trained it and where all that code lives. So it's not looking at my specific application here. It's looking at it. It basically was trained on a number of different code bases, and then from that, it's making interpretations on what might be the next suggestion.
That's cool. It would be nice to be able to point that to like a library of snippets that you could share within your group or within the enterprise, because that's one of the biggest challenges right now. Is we're solving the same problem a million different ways.
Yeah, and so a couple different things, right? So one of those, I don't know if you've heard the term, but something that when we talk about GitHub and GitHub Enterprise, we talk about inner source, right? What's that? Instead of open source and looking for projects that are openly available for you to bring into your application, what's that application that we've already written that might be a good starting point for this? So using some existing code repository as a template to start off your next project, or looking for the projects that you've already created that talk to some line of business application internally, and using that that code repository to pull that code in, so you don't have to rewrite it again. So I think you're right. I think there's two things there. There's some things that can happen now when we think inner source, but then there's things that we can think of that can happen in the future when we think of, well, it's just an AI engine. It's just whatever that training model I'm pointing it to. And in this case, it's our code repository internally, because how you write code based on your internal coding standards, I'm sure, is a little different than, you know, how others might do it, right? So give it that little bit of local flair to what it suggests. Great idea. Well, cool. We covered a lot in just under an hour. Questions, comments? Anybody?
I have a question for Codespace. How do I enroll for the Codespace? I try to sign up online, but it says I'm on the wait list. Is there any other option I can try that out?
Codespaces specifically, either through GitHub Enterprise. If you have a GitHub Enterprise environment, that's one way. Other than that, there's nothing like on the public repos. I don't believe that's there's still a wait list for that. What you can do, though, as you saw, is get that same functionality, but have it running locally inside of your inside of a remote connection, just like we did with this one here, and having this run inside of container.
Docker container. Okay.
Yeah. Getting a line in the preview is the only. I mean, same thing with Copilot, right? There's still a preview capability there. So if you sign up for it, you ultimately they will, you know, continue to let more people in over time. But yeah, that's the only suggestion I have there.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I will do one last thing because I think it's kind of interesting. And I don't know if anybody has seen this before. If I just go to this, yeah, it's fine. This is just a repository. Any repository in GitHub. Yeah, here's Azure Web Apps to play. Cool. Doesn't matter what repository you are in, I think. If you just hit the period key, that's fine. This is actually setting up a web editor. So this is Visual Studio Code in the browser. And it's giving me the ability to essentially connect into this repository that is here. And, you know, I have, just like I would locally, I have the ability to go ahead and open a branch. I can switch branches. I can make changes. I can do my check-ins here. This would be, and I'm not sure you just asked that question about the Codespaces pilot. This might be another alternative, right? It's a little bit of a limited functionality, right? So Visual Studio Code, if I hit Control, I don't get that functionality here. A little bit of limitation on, you know, what kind of plugins or add-ins you can include as well. But to very quickly get access to a code base and be able to make changes just on any repository, just be able to hit the dot will let you jump right in. And
Man, you should have started with this one. This is cool.
Awesome. I knew I saved the best for last. There you go. I thought it was Copilot was going to be the best, but yeah, who knew? Excellent. All right, Bill, that's it. I think I'm out.